Stay back, man. I got this.
Hey everyone, the full build of Resident Evil 2 Remake is in our hands. Now it's not been long since we looked at the demo build. Alex's excellent analysis is already up, but today we're going to take a look at the final build just to see how things are pairing out for the full range of consoles, PlayStation 4s and Xbox Ones and their enhanced equivalents. And to join me to talk about that is John Linneman.
Yeah, I think it's good to talk about this since I've also been playing this game like crazy, working on the other analysis since we've decided to split this off again so that you can get what you're looking for. And the console comparison, well, the results aren't quite what I had hoped for.
No, certainly if we're talking, about the tech, there's all those amazing features that come from the RE engine. And it's been quite a season for that engine actually. We looked at Devil May Cry 5 recently. But yeah, so we get, filmic per object motion blur, SSR, volumetric lighting, bokeh depth of field, amazing facial animations. I love the use of torchlights in this game.
Not to mention the hair rendering, which is just tremendously good in this.
Oh yeah, big time, yeah. And, even ragdolls on enemies. There's lots of physics going on here.
Yeah, I even noticed things like enemies falling and climbing over objects and just the way they react to all the shots. It's all very well done, and everything we've seen thus far from this and the other games suggests that the RE engine is it is the sequel we've been waiting for to MT Framework. So even though Panta Ray is quite dead at this point, I think things are looking pretty good with this engine.
So, John, what do you want to know about the console versions of Resident Evil 2 Remake?
Well, I guess I should say I've been playing primarily on PS4 Pro and on Xbox One X, so I went for the premium experience all around. But I guess my first point of curiosity then is the base console, since I am familiar with the other versions. Has anything changed since the demo? Are we still looking at those lower resolutions, or I guess the expected resolutions on the base systems?
Pretty much. We've got 1920 by 1080 on PS4 and Xbox One. The distinction there is really that, and I think we noticed this in the demo and even Resident Evil 7, that Xbox One version looks blurrier, and it's not significant. This is quite a dark game, everything's shrouded in shadow, and so it can hide a lot of the degraded image quality, but definitely if you look at them side by side, you'll see base Xbox One's the blurrier of the two. We've discussed this before, but there is an issue of image breakup when a scene changes. There's a hard cut to another character or something. You're going to see like the hair on a character specifically appears in a very low-res blocky form for a couple of frames on Xbox One, and then it kind of resolves and fills in again. You're going to get a lot of that just on camera cuts, and it does suggest, there's no absolute confirmation, but there is an indication that could be reconstruction, but what it resolves to is definitely 1080p.
What's interesting about that though is that the PC version also has an option called interlaced, which does kind of a similar thing, but it presents itself in a very different way, so that's not what we're seeing here. But I agree that from what I've seen of the original Xbox One, it does seem to be using potentially something like a reconstruction technique, but it's hard to say for sure. Though I think what we've seen on the Pro and the X consoles then, it's kind of the inverse of Xbox One versus base PS4, where it looks like the Pro version has a similar artifact as the base Xbox One when looking at a scene cut, where it's almost like reconstruction artifacts around the hair and various other edges, while Xbox One X doesn't exhibit that at all.
Yeah, definitely. There's 2880 by 1620 resolution, if you like, and the Pro, as you say, is definitely doing something a little bit over the top on scene changes to kind of reform like hair especially. But yeah, I'm not sure how you felt about it when playing them both kind of live and not slowing them down necessarily. Did you see anything obvious, or is it a passing bit of trivia?
So I guess that's always kind of the thing to mention here when talking about things like reconstruction filters and whatnot. How does it actually impact the experience? And this is a weird one because people notice this a lot in the demo, and I do see it here as well. Essentially, the PS4 Pro version does appear slightly sharper to the point where it actually resolves more detail on distant objects, and this has kind of been a point of contention since X owners are getting a slightly softer presentation. But that doesn't mean the results are bad on the X. In fact, in some ways, from the normal viewing distance for me, which is about 7 feet from a 65-inch screen, I feel like the X version ends up looking a tad cleaner, since the Pro version exhibits a lot of specular shimmering on edges throughout the game. So when you're turning the camera and running around, you see more in the way of that sort of sparkling around edges, which, while still there on the X, does seem slightly reduced. So in that sense, they kind of each have their pros and cons, but I guess the main takeaway is if you saw the demo and you noticed this and you were bothered by it, it doesn't seem to have changed at all. It's the exact same setup that we saw there, and you're going to have to kind of decide whether that's an issue or not.
They pretty much copy-pasted the setup from Resident Evil 7 for all these consoles. And back then, when I did the face-off analysis on the X version, I thought, you know, I'm wondering if there is a reconstruction on Pro and, you know, if that's the cause for a slight difference in quality. But ultimately, I came to the conclusion it's more likely a difference in anti-aliasing method. But I definitely agree the X has a more, I guess the way you'd phrase it is a pristine quality. A lot of the roughness is kind of smoothed over, and I do have a preference for it. But, you know, it's not a bad way to go. Fundamentally, the pixel count, the way it resolves, is still 1620p on both consoles.
I think it's just a matter of deciding whether you want a little blur or a little more shimmering, but other than that, you know, it's a very similar setup. So I guess the question I have then is, comes down to differences between them. I've compared slightly with the X and the Pro, and I've noticed a few things, but you've been checking out the base consoles as well. Like, are there any other noticeable visual differences, particularly on those lower end machines?
Well, I'd imagine for ease of development, Capcom kept things fairly straightforward on all four, and that basically translates to, you know, textures and geometry. They're the same all round, and so we don't really have to worry too much about anything on that level. There's a difference in effects, especially post-process effects. Blur is seemingly high quality on Pro and X, which means you get a different sample rate on moving objects, so more gradients on Pro and X as something moves across, and fewer on the base consoles. So
I will say though about motion blur, it's nice that it's featured here, but with the way the shutter speed is set up, it's not something that sticks out in a significant way during gameplay, which is slightly detrimental to me. I really liked the way the motion blur worked in games like Resident Evil 5. It still looks good here, but you're right, the sample count does appear to be higher on the Pro and the X, which is great.
Also, I did notice a difference in screen space reflection quality, mainly between the PlayStation 4 family of consoles and the Xbox Ones. So if we take Pro versus X as an example here, you do see more dithering, more sort of breakup on the reflective material on PS4 Pro than Xbox One X, and the same sort of pairs down to the base consoles.
One feature we should mention before we continue though is that I think for this comparison we turned off film grain, and you can kind of see here that it's on one side and then disabled on the other, and the reason we did that for this comparison, it really has to do with video encoding and, you know, the way YouTube treats video. Disabling it does actually slightly improve image quality there and reduce the file size, I suppose, when encoding the video. So this option is available on all consoles, on all platforms in fact, but it's turned off just for this video.
Yeah, and surprisingly I didn't really notice much of a difference overall, because the image is so processed anyway. You're still getting definitely a busy image, let's say. Looking at the visual comparisons, there's only kind of one other point, which is in shadows. There's a difference in shadow quality when we look at this door here. That kind of pairs down across all consoles. It's very subtle, but basically amounts to less dithering on edges on X compared to, you know, the base Xbox One. Same with ambient occlusion. There's a different method on Xbox One X, where I wouldn't say it's better or worse, but it is a different technique.
It's just different, yeah.
Yeah, and that leaves you with spots of shade in one area of a room, and they'll be absent in another spot. So nothing major, really.
Okay, so I think then the other point of differentiation that we should discuss, and this is kind of a big one, is the performance then. So, you know, we have the basic layout of the visual quality here, but performance is interesting. So I'll start with the Pro and X then, since you've played a lot on the base consoles as well. I've started primarily on Pro, and the experience is good. The game does target 60 frames per second, and it holds it most of the time to the point where it feels suitably locked, but during certain busier sections and just at various points throughout the game, I definitely noticed dips into the 50s, and it's moderately distracting when it occurs, but it doesn't linger long enough to really create an issue. It still feels very stable. Whereas over on the X, I found that the general performance in those same sorts of areas was improved. The X's average frame rate is higher than on PS4 Pro, but there is a difference in that I did notice X sort of dropping frames in areas where the Pro did not, and in ways that didn't always make a lot of sense to me. Like, you would see it during certain cutscenes. While the Pro is completely smooth, the X version exhibits a few dips, which is kind of frustrating. And also, just at various points during the gameplay, you'd see a few skips and dips here and there on the X, which I found a little bit odd, but still, the average rate of performance is higher on X. It's a smoother game overall, and I assume you found pretty much the same thing, Tom.
I did in the end, yeah. There were maybe 1 or 2 skips and small one-frame dips on X that Pro just didn't have. But in general, I processed through a good 10-minute chunk of gameplay from all 4 consoles, and so I've got a 4-way side-by-side going on here. And yeah, generally, X sticks to that 60 FPS line more doggedly than any other version, and it's the Pro, if anything, between the two that will drop. I think there is a very clear-cut winner in terms of which you should go for if you are after the best performance on console. The general feeling is that maybe, Pro could have done with an adaptive VSync, maybe a small amount of tearing at the top to clear it up or something like that. We were saying earlier, like FreeSync support would be interesting for this one, and I think Pro could probably benefit from that being in the 50 to 60 range.
I agree for the Pro, and honestly, I'd be curious to see how this works on Xbox One X with a FreeSync display. I don't have one here capable of testing on the X, but because those dips are generally so minor, I suspect that being that this is a V-synced game, it should be compatible, and I'd imagine it would clean those up pretty nicely.
What people have on their screens right now is the base console readings as well, which kind of scream at you as you go through it. Yeah, definitely. I don't think FreeSync would save this one. There's just a lot of drops, not even sub 60, it's sub 50 a lot of the time, even in gameplay. And it's to the point that you're wondering, is this really made for these consoles? Did Capcom target the enhanced machines and just leave it to run as is on the base machines, come what may?
Yeah, that's an interesting point and something I've thought about. And this is where I feel they've made a slight error in their design. So I applaud them for targeting 60 frames per second in all their recent games. So, obviously Resident Evil 7, Devil May Cry 5, and this are all going for 60 FPS, and that's great. But you only really get that on the upgraded consoles. If you're on a base system, you certainly are not getting 60 FPS. So I think we both feel that the solution here would have been a proper 30 frames per second cap. And in fact, that's even something I think that should have been included on the upgraded consoles. Like, on Xbox One X, for instance, if they had a native 4K 30 FPS mode, for instance, or even on the Pro, maybe it could have done like checkerboard 4K at 30 or something like that. I think that would have been a nice option for players to have, and really on the base consoles, it absolutely should be there because the frame rate does seem to stay north of 30 FPS on those systems, so you would get a very consistent experience there, but as it is, it's extremely unstable, and to me, I would never want to play it on the base Xbox or base PS4 as a result of this, whereas with a 30 FPS cap, it would be a lot more reasonable, so, come on, players need choices here, I think.
It's just a shame, because it is a third-person game, and there's a lot of free camera movement. You are going to pick up on that judder. The motion blur, it's not full screen, is it? It's only the per object form.
Yeah, it's just objects.
So there's no real way to really mask the judder. So it is kind of left there raw, but still the enhanced consoles are where to play right now. It's a pretty strong candidate for 60 FPS most of the way through those versions, so at least we do have that.
Is there anything else that you notice standing out? Because for me, I feel like, the performance res and comparison stuff, that pretty much encapsulates everything between these different versions.
I think we should leave that for your full tech breakdown of the game with comparisons to the original.
Yeah, it may be up at this point. It's definitely worth checking out, where it's a little bit more of an exploration of the technology in the game, but also primarily like a huge comparison with how the game has evolved since the PlayStation original. So
the RE engine returns. It looks like there's a full season of it with Devil May Cry 5 as well. And to be honest, I'm glad Capcom are taking this route, targeting 60. But yeah, for now, that'll do it for the comparisons. Hope you enjoyed it or found it useful in any way. If you did, give us a like or subscribe. And of course, hit the bell for notifications as any new video lands. To get in contact with me or John, just use Twitter. But from the both of us, thanks for watching.